The age-old task of religious art has been to bridge the division between the sacred and mundane, the spiritual and the material, the self and the other. We now live in a time when this division is at its most extreme. But from the very beginnings of human consciousness, a particular religious art form has assuaged the terror of separation by creating a special site to serve the human desire for relationship with unseen gods and spirits. We call that place an altar. An altar makes visible that which is invisible and brings near that which is far away. It marks the potential for communication and exchange between different but necessarily connected worlds, the human and the divine. That was from Beautiful Necessity, The Art and Meaning of Women's Altars by Kay Turner, which is linked in the description for you. For most of us, the concept of the witch's altar is both the most exciting and confusing part of delving into a witchy lifestyle. For many who follow other spiritual paths, the altar is an essential piece of the puzzle. But if we're going it alone, we might either not know how to set up an altar or be afraid of somehow setting it up wrong. I've been asked a couple of times about my altar setup, so I decided I need to finally delve into the theme and stop avoiding it. First things first though, I want to know how many of you keep an altar and why. Go ahead and add a comment below, and then let's get into the discussion. Merry meet everyone, I'm Witch Hazel, sharing with you what I've learned over the years about merging the practical, hands-on side of witchcraft with the often more elusive spiritual side of things. The key concept, which I like to relate everything back to, is the idea of strengthening the intuition in order to deepen the divine connection. As we're going to see in this video, the altar serves as a reminder of this. You'll also find my 4-step guide to strengthening intuition linked in the description for anyone who hasn't gotten it yet. So if you want to see some major advances in your magical manifesting abilities within 30 days or so, pick that up as well. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the little notification bell so you don't miss any upcoming videos about witchy and spiritual practices. Okay, so question of the day. Do I keep an altar? Yes and no. In the past, I have kept a formal altar, and later in this video, I'm going to demonstrate how to set one up. But as you know, if you've been following my videos about the concept of the home altar, my preferences have evolved to considering my entire home my altar. Even so, I do like to keep at least a small corner for a dedicated mini altar space to dedicate to the protectress of the hearth and home, which for me is Frigg of the Norse pantheon. I've come to the conclusion over the years that the more important question here is, why keep an altar? An altar is a reminder to perform our spiritual duties and not let the mundane world crowd out our spiritual growth. For anyone who needs this reminder, an altar can be an essential part of their lives. An altar is also practical. A formal altar, which many witches will set up, has its origins in the ritual altar of covens. As such, this altar was either set up from scratch or modified before each coven gathering. Back when I was in a coven, we set up the altar from scratch each time. And that was because the space we met in was reserved for the event rather than being in someone's home. The altar houses all necessary components of ritual work and prevents issues with having to pass through the protective field of the circle once it's cast if something was forgotten. The altar that many witches set up at home is a copy of this coven altar and used for their own private home rituals. Whenever an altar is set up in a home, it's just convenient to leave it set up and maintain it because we know we're going to use the altar tools regularly. So the altar by default becomes an organizational tool as well as a spiritual symbol. For solitary practitioners or spiritualists who do not follow a prescribed religion, the layout of the altar becomes much more fluid and personal. The keeper of the altar decides what tools are necessary to have on hand, what needs to be displayed, and the person has creative license essentially with aesthetics. Also, let's not forget that we can have multiple altars for multiple uses. If we don't perform a ritual, we don't need a full ritual altar, right? I mentioned my current corner altar is dedicated to a particular deity, but in the past I've also set up ancestor altars. The purpose of the altar will dictate what goes on it. The altar in most cases is as ornate or as simple as the person or people putting it together want it to be. So, how do we actually set up an altar? I'm going to discuss two influences I'm familiar with, and then briefly describe my simplified home altar. First up, we have the formal Wiccan ritual altar. This is what I first learned in my coven and what I had set up for a time when I first went out on my own as a solitary. I'm going to take the details straight from the Farrars and their Witch's Bible, which is also linked in the description for you. Please note I no longer have several of the items listed, so I will be using substitutions. The ritual altar is set up in the north. It can be set up on a table or even on the floor if need be. The altar space is designated by setting down an altar cloth. Traditional Wicca associates north with the element of earth. In my coven, we linked it with air. The elemental candle is therefore at the top of the altar space. In the center is a pentacle used for charging ritual items. On either side of the altar are the altar candles, which represent fire and help to illuminate the space for reading the Book of Shadows. To the west, there is a bowl of water to represent the water element. To the east or north, a bowl of salt to represent earth. Also to north or east, depending on your tradition, is an incense burner to represent air. A sword and or wand and or athame will be placed to the south. The athame is the black-handled dagger used to direct energy. The wand serves the same purpose. The sword is used mainly for circle casting. A bell is also placed on the altar, as well as a chalice and dish with cakes. The chalice and cakes are part of the grounding at the end of the ritual. The bell is most commonly used during invocations. On a traditional altar, you will also find a bolin, which is the white-handled curved knife used with herbs, as well as scourge and cords. Since my coven was non-denominational, we did not include these final two items. So the basic idea is to decide what tools are necessary and arrange them on the altar according to what element they correspond with. The other main influence I had was Scott Cunningham. In his guide for solitary practitioners, again, linked below, he divides the altar into 3 symbolic sections: left for the goddess, right for the god, and center for both of them. The tools are essentially the same. and the same rules for placement apply. Although he goes more into detail about the symbolism of the protective circle and suggests placing the tools at the cardinal points rather than all on the altar. For a solitary who will be moving around the circle during ritual, this would make sense. Interestingly, no one directly mentions representations of the god and goddess, but every altar I've ever seen or worked with had these. So these can be as simple as designations for the altar candles, or something completely separate like statuary or artwork. In both cases, the authors didn't seem very concerned about the setup of the altar, outside of generalities. The more important factor was the symbolism of the altar and its tools. So keep this in mind if the idea of an altar seems overwhelming. None of it is really necessary. In the end, you are the spiritual conduit. So never worry that if you don't have tools, you can't follow your path. Okay, so now that we have the formal stuff out of the way, let's talk simple. As mentioned, I keep an altar to the goddess of the home. Over the years, this setup has gotten smaller and simpler. My current setup is really just two pieces that manage to represent the goddess and all of the elements. I have a single white taper candle representing both the goddess and fire, and a small bowl representative of the water element filled with incense to represent air, and a small polished stone to represent earth. Done. It serves its purpose and complements the aesthetic of my home. Extra plus. It's also simplistic enough not to encourage any sideways glances from visitors. I let the rest of my decor do that. And there you have it, the altar setup from formal to simplistic. There really are no make or break rules. Your practice is between you and your spiritual representation of choice. When setting up an altar, the important thing is to follow your intuition. If you and your intuition are not on great terms, this is your reminder to pick up my 4-step guide to strengthening your intuition and developing that divine connection that's going to provide you with all of the answers you need in life. You can find the link in the description. If you've enjoyed today's video, please also remember to like the video and subscribe to the channel. I've got loads more fun videos planned to share, and so until the next time, everyone, blessed be.